A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, with the monumental developments this week in the United States and the survival of former President Donald Trump from an attempted assassination, we might be concerned with what comes next. I mean, Trump calls his survival a miracle. This week is the Republican National Convention. You've got President Joe Biden, who's called for a lowering of the temperature in the wake of the shooting. And there, of course, are all those issues around the motives of the 20-year-old shooter. Well, Stephen McAlpine is back with us, award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Stephen McAlpine, a special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil, on an eventful week.
It is eventful, and let me start with the words of Donald Trump, who says it was God alone who prevented the unthinkable from happening, and he's calling his survival a miracle. A quick thought or two from you before we get into some meaty stuff?
Well, you could go one or two ways with that, couldn't you? If you believe in a sovereign God, you're going to believe that anyway. That's true. Everything is, if a sparrow doesn't fall to the ground without God knowing, then I'm sure a bullet doesn't. But also you'd have to be careful how you navigate that in terms of, is this a sense of which it's like a proverbial rising again, or someone who dodged a bullet in order to be great. You know, it feels like every conversation is fraught with so many different possibilities when you talk about these things. And that's probably what we're going to talk about today a little bit.
And, you know, Donald Trump isn't afraid to use those sorts of Christian words. And there is a sense in which, particularly in the United States, and it would be the same a lot of Western nations, where Christians tend to be drawn towards people who use the right sorts of terminology. Any thoughts around the fact that he does acknowledge things like miracles and God preventing the unthinkable? Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, well, I'd say for a start that if you think about Glenn Scrivener's book, The Air We Breathe, he deals with the fact that, and Tom Holland does this as the historian, that we breathe Christian air in the West. So the language we use, the terms we use, the way we frame things, even if we're not a person who's a Christian in a confessing sense, that's in our speech, and so we use those terms. So it's very much a commonality gathering kind of language. So Donald Trump's very smart in using it. He may mean different things by some of the things, but in one sense, the language is common to our understanding of the West, I think, and that's why it resonates with people.
Let's come back to the assassination attempt. What do you think these monumental things this week, what do you think they're doing to the political discourse, both in America and really for people like us and ordinary Aussies who are talking about these things around the dinner table and at the water cooler? Yeah,
that's interesting, because I looked at, I get both sides of the opinion. I get papers from both of the sides of the political divide. And in one sense, to say now, well, we've got to dial down the rhetoric because of this, in one sense, it was the dialing up of the rhetoric before it that leads to it. And it doesn't feel like the rhetoric will dial down at some level. I think that things have gone too far, because what we're experiencing is that we've got a very polarized political setting where there are two very different visions of where we're headed as a culture, not just a country. So it's not just the United States. Western nations feel the same things to varying degrees. One of the things I would say is when you amp up the language about someone to that level, as I think the Democrats did about, Donald Trump, it's hard to then ramp that back down and say, well, we didn't really mean that he was a threat to Western democracy now that he's had a shot taken at him. I think that's a hard one to call. I think that's part of the problem, is that the dialogue has gone too far and it's going to be hard to rein it in.
Language has changed, hasn't it? People are much more overt in calling for someone to be silenced, for someone to be, cancelled, and even in the sense of, I've seen those images too, of people calling for Donald Trump to be killed. So languages and the images that are created in our minds, any thoughts from you here on what's been going on in their dialogue?
Yeah, look, I think once religion no longer becomes the main conversation in the public square or the main reality, something takes its place. And in this sense, it's politics. So politics has taken the role where religion used to hold in the public square. And so politics becomes God. So the language isn't just about right or wrong, your opponent's wrong, you're right, it's you're good and they're evil. And you start to get this binary nature of how we discuss people who are opposing us, and it almost becomes religious in its language. And I think that's where you start to get problems. And that's happening across the West. As Christianity's receded, you see that people don't view there as a God above who buffers politics from being absolute. Politics is now absolute in the West in a way that it was in the communist bloc in Europe, say 60, 70 years ago.
Is it a useful thing in our faith that when we talk about a battle between good and evil, a cosmic battle between light and darkness, that in some sense that's a preservation for our ability not to be hammer and tong and attacking one another? Is there a sense in which there's something in our Christian faith that actually helps to alleviate the need to kill one another?
Yeah, apart from you shall not kill, yeah, there's a few things in there, Neil. I think what I'd say is part of the issue is it's the self-awareness that the Bible gives to us that we are all sinful and that we are all rebels against our Creator that should actually tone us down a little. And it took, was it Alexander Solzhenitsyn to say that the fault line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And once you start to see yourself as pure as the driven snow and your opposition as sort of, black as the ace of spades in their hearts, then you start to get this dial-up of language. And we don't have a very nuanced politics at the moment. And part of that's driven by the critical theory issues around identity politics. And part of it's been responded to by a harder right perspective as well. So what you're losing the middle ground, and that's been happening for 20 years across the West, that the middle ground has been vacated as, social media dials it up as well and rewards bad behaviour, and you get these extremes happening.
The middle ground being vacated as tolerance in some ways evaporates. And that tolerance is something that I guess must come somehow quite significantly from our Christian ethic as well.
Yeah, the Christian ethic gave us the public square that said, and Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. But if you don't have a picture of God in that framework, everything becomes Caesar's. And then we also have a saviour who, when he was assassinated, so to speak, was forgive, not fight. And I think there's something in that the gospel message draws us back from the extremes to which we would push. When Christianity is lived out according to how Jesus called us to in those areas, we can still fight for things well in the public square without seeing them as absolute to the point that we would do anything to achieve them. And that's our worry, that people will do almost anything to achieve. And I read it in one of the more progressive newspapers even a couple of weeks ago. We need to do everything necessary to stop, say, Donald Trump becoming president. And I think, well, within what bounds? Surely the bounds of democracy. But that didn't come across.
So democracy is very much at risk. And depending on the side you take, you're blaming the other because it's always their fault. And so democracy itself is at risk because you've got to have tolerance for that democracy to actually happen and for a peaceful transfer of power when that time comes. Hey, let me ask you about the way we in Australia, maybe we're a little behind the US, but there's this polarising debate that's going on in America, but it seems to be also deepening and very polarising here in Australia, this left-right culture divide. Any thoughts here on how we're affected by the sorts of things that are going on around Donald Trump?
Yes, look, I think appreciated Prime Minister Albanese's comments the other week. Even the other week, we're saying we can't get to a stage where our parliamentary members can't go into their offices because they're afraid of people who are hanging around the front. And we can't get to that stage. This cannot happen. And so I think Australia always gets the blowback a little bit from the United States on this. And we're seeing in our own many ways here. And identity politics comes through the cultural frame and then affects our politics, I think. So it comes to the academies. And we've seen the same things happen in our academies here, where you see the anti-Semitism that was on display outside our universities. And that worries me that a younger generation hasn't learned, or maybe hasn't even understood history in the first place, as to how we get to these hot moments. And they don't really know how they would put the genie back in the bottle if something happened. And I think it's up to our leaders, and I think Anthony Albanese's done it quite well in the last few weeks, of just trying to dial that down and say, that's not how we're supposed to go forward. Now, it's interesting too, a couple of months ago, the man who grew up as a Catholic and then disavowed it has suddenly been going back quietly to church every Sunday. And it does tell you that the Prime Minister is thinking maybe politics isn't going to solve this for us fully.
Yes, and, as we've seen from previous Prime Ministers too, also attending church is a very good political move too, if you want to win Christian votes. Hey, come back to this hot points idea again, because you've got both President Joe Biden calling for a lowering of the temperature in the wake of the shooting, and you've got Donald Trump too, who is anticipated and reported to include in his speech to the Republican National Convention this week a call for national unity, a chance to bring the country together. So something like this, a flashpoint. Is there a possibility that this might see some sort of lowering of the temperature, do you think?
Look, I think I personally think it's too late for that. I read the Wall Street Journal and I read the New York Times, the New Yorker, I read all of those papers, and it feels like one side is saying, well, the problem's really with the other side, and the other side saying, well, the problem's with that side. So I feel like the way we debate politics today isn't going to leave much room for the unity thing. And what I've written about it in the past, saying that every time a new prime minister or president gets in the West at the moment, the first day is talking about unity, and then the next 3 to 4 years shows that that isn't possible. We don't have a unifying vision of what it means to go forward as a community, and we've got a polarizing understanding of what human flourishing looks like. We've even got a polarizing understanding of what it means to be human, and that's part of the issue.
Come back to this political discourse idea for a moment, because the things that people are saying, whether it's in mainstream media or on television or in the social media, it's leading to what we might even compare to a radicalisation that happens in sort of a religious sense, but a radicalisation when it comes to political ideologies, and really coming to the point where there are triggers for this sort of violence that we've seen. Any thoughts here around the 20-year-old young man who has lost his own life now, and the fact that he seems to have been radicalised in such a way as he took the action he did?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'll be interested to see how that all pans out about his background. And a young loner who was bullied at school. I mean, it's ticking a lot of the boxes, right? And who, interestingly, was a Republican. He was penciled in as a Republican, but gave money to a progressive cause when Obama came to power. It doesn't seem like he'd been a real political animal, but something goes on about. I think we're in a moment in our culture where younger people are in despair or they're angry, and there's not a lot of middle ground. And if you have been that person who's struggled all your life and you're now seeing it get worse, there wasn't any chance that he was going to get out of that alive, really. I mean, look how close he was to the president, and there were snipers facing him, and he still took the shot. It feels like there was something deeper going on with him as well, some sort of despair.
The image that comes to mind is the idea of something like an ideological kamikaze, because how could that young man have gotten out of bed on that morning and planning to shoot the former president, knowing too that he would also be killed doing that, and that it would be filmed and would be seen around the world, and he'd go down in infamy as the person who would kill Donald Trump. There's something significant, isn't there, when the radicalisation pushes you to a point of what would be almost like a suicide mission?
Yeah, it's nihilism. There's something nihilistic going on at the moment, I think. And part of that is the wider narrative that we have no hope in our world, that we're either all going to burn up with climate change, or the democracy is going to fall by the wayside, or World War III will happen. And even if it doesn't, you can't afford a house anyway. And it feels like all these are making a perfect storm for a very anxious age and a highly anxious generation of younger people coming through. And I actually think that the gospel is going to shine brighter in the midst of that time. It's going to be a situation where the gospel is going to have to show a way forward for people who can live with their deepest differences, because it has to get to that. It can't get worse, surely.
And if there's something that has so loudly been shouted in this event, is that we are all mortal. Life is fleeting. We may not make it until tomorrow, and there is an eternity to be faced. What do you think the events of the attempted assassination might say to us as we think about our own lives and the value of what we do and the purpose for what we have?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Neil. I think when you think that Donald Trump was 1 inch movement of his head away from seeing Jesus as his judge and king, you would think that would sober you, and you would think that that would make you reflect on what that miracle he was given actually was. Was it the miracle to run the country? Was it a miracle to repent and believe the gospel? Because I think moments like this should sober us and as to our own mortality. Because we've been looking at Joe Biden's mortality for so long, because we assume often that we have a trajectory into our death that we can see, that we can anticipate, but it just takes one shot to the other president's ear, nearly his head, to show that both men are mortal, and that should sober us about our own mortality and about what humans can achieve in this age.
And with both of these men, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, the likely two that will go head-to-head for the presidential election, and at their ages and what might come beyond. But in some sense, with an event that's happened this week with Donald Trump, we might hope that both men survive until the election. But that's not even a guarantee, is it, when you get these sorts of things happening?
No, and I was reading a great article by Niall Ferguson, the British philosopher, historian, and he was saying, he was quoting an article of himself a few weeks ago saying, we're not inherently like Rome where assassinations were going to happen all the time, so both men will probably reach November 5 thanks to good medicine and law and order. And then he wrote today, now I'm not so sure. And I feel these events of the last few days have shaken up everyone's view of how history's going to turn out. Where's the next move? Things like that. And I think perhaps that's good. It takes us away from being proud that we can somehow control the future, because clearly we can't.
Okay, put our faith in God. He's the one who holds tomorrow, whether we're talking about people who would be candidates in a presidential election or whether we're talking about our own lives. Stephen McAlpine, always wonderful getting your insights. Stephen's an award-winning Christian author, pastor, national consultant for churches and Christian schools. You can connect with Stephen McAlpine at stephenmcalpine.com. That's stephenmcalpine.com. Stephen, thanks so much for talking to us once again today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Another very interesting fortnight.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.